Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be looking at this idea of weird mysticism.
Yeah.
And specifically, we're going to be using Brad Baumgartner's book,
Right.
Weird Mysticism, as our kind of jumping off point.
A roadmap.
A roadmap, that's right. And we're going to be looking at three authors in particular that he examines in his book.
Right.
Thomas Ligotti,
Yes.
Georges Bataille,
Of course.
and E.M. Cioran.
Quite the trifecta.
Yeah, so we're in for a pretty bleak ride here.
I think bleak is an understatement. I think we're talking about just absolute nihilistic negativity.
Well, let's dive in and see what we can find.
Okay.
So, what is weird mysticism? I mean, it's kind of a strange term. What does Baumgartner mean when he says weird mysticism?
Well, he defines weird as becoming and ties it to individuation. But he argues that this becoming isn't this kind of straightforward path to self-discovery. It's a bizarre and often horrifying encounter with the alien within ourselves and the reality we inhabit. And the mysticism part comes into play through the lens of negative theology or apophaticism, which attempts to describe the divine by stating what it is not, acknowledging the limits of language in the face of ultimate reality.
So in a sense, it's kind of like that that idea of like the map is not the territory kind of thing that we always talk about.
Exactly. It's recognizing that our concepts, our language, our frameworks can only take us so far. And when it comes to the ultimate nature of reality, we're left with this kind of negative space, this void that can't be fully grasped or articulated.
Yeah, and it's in that void that we encounter, the horror, the kind of the weird, the sense of the uncanny.
Yeah, Baumgartner even brings up Simone Weil. She writes in Gravity and Grace, "I must love being nothing. How horrible it would be if I were something." It's a very provocative statement, right? And it speaks to this paradoxical nature of mystical experience, this confrontation with the void, the nothingness as a source of both terror and a strange sort of love.
It's interesting you bring up horror because one of the things that I was really interested in about Baumgartner's book was his connection between this idea of weird mysticism and horror as a genre, and specifically he uses H.P. Lovecraft as kind of an example.
Yeah, Baumgartner argues that even though Lovecraft was an atheist, he utilizes apophatic techniques in his writing to evoke a sense of dread and cosmic horror in the face of this vast, indifferent universe.
I mean, it's almost like Lovecraft in a way is a mystic without God.
In a way, yeah. I mean, take his poem Ex Oblivione, for example. The narrator describes death as a dissolution into this kind of native infinity, right? And the unsettling part is that it's presented as something pleasant. This challenges our human categories of good and evil, meaning and purpose, suggesting they're utterly insignificant against the backdrop of cosmic indifference.
And that's what Baumgartner refers to as the apophasis of horror, right?
Exactly. He's using negative language to describe the indescribable, leaving the reader to confront their own sense of existential dread.
And he also has this really interesting term, apophatic humanism.
Right.
Which I thought was really fascinating. This idea that embracing the unknowing is actually a path to becoming fully human.
It's a radical proposition, right? Especially when you contrast it with traditional humanist philosophies, which tend to emphasize reason, progress, and the inherent goodness of humanity. Apophatic humanism suggests that our true essence lies in recognizing the limitations of reason, the inherent darkness at the core of our being.
Yeah, and this brings us to Thomas Ligotti, who is the first of our three authors that we're going to be examining.
Right.
And his work is really interesting because it's steeped in this pessimistic, apophatic worldview.
Yeah, I mean, you really see this influence of apophatic thought in Ligotti's work. He uses these philosophical horror stories to expose the deeply unsettling nature of existence itself.
He's a master of using negativity and the aesthetics of horror to create a sense of what he calls macabre unreality.
It's not a world for the faint of heart, right?
Oh, really?
There's no sugarcoating the bleakness, the inherent meaninglessness, the cosmic indifference that haunts human consciousness.
A great example of this is his short story, The Medusa, where he takes this classical myth and uses it to explore this idea of macabre unreality. The protagonist, Lucian Dregler, becomes obsessed with the Medusa as a representation of the ultimate horror of being.
It's more than just a literal interpretation of the myth, though, right? It's about petrification, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. Dregler's fixation on the Medusa leads to a kind of intellectual and existential paralysis, a freezing of his being in the face of the ultimate void.
And this fear is something very human. It's this fear of confronting the truth of existence.
Absolutely. And Ligotti doesn't shy away from that fear. He forces us to confront it head on.
And he does this in another story as well, The Mystics of Muhlenberg. This story depicts a town where the residents are desperately trying to distract themselves from what Ligotti calls the ancient formlessness lurking beneath the surface of reality.
It's like all of our attempts to create meaning, to impose order and purpose on this chaotic universe are ultimately futile. The true horror isn't some external monster, but the realization that our own consciousness is a fragile construct, a thin veil separating us from the abyss.
What I find so interesting is how Ligotti uses apophatic discourse differently than someone like Bataille.
Yeah.
Where Bataille was looking for a kind of intimacy through the impossible. Ligotti uses it to reinforce a negative and deictic view of reality.
Yeah, it's a very bleak and uncompromising perspective. It really leaves the reader with a profound sense of dread.
And you see this in the story in a foreign town, in a foreign land, where the character Ascrobius literally uncreates himself from existence through contemplation.
It's a chilling image, right? This idea that modern selfhood might be inherently flawed, something to be escaped rather than embraced.
And it's almost like Ligotti is saying that consciousness itself is the trap.
Yeah, and true liberation lies in dissolving the illusion of self.
He takes this idea even further in the Salal, which evokes Masiandaro's concept of the black universe, a realm of pure negativity and void.
The characters in the story encounter a place without nature or essence. It's a terrifying vision of ultimate nothingness.
And it's interesting because he doesn't just present this black universe as an abstract concept. He uses this technique of liminality,
Right.
this blurring of boundaries between life and non-life, to create an atmosphere of pervasive unease.
Yeah. His stories are filled with characters who exist in these in-between spaces, caught between reality and nightmare sanity and madness. There's this constant sense of what he calls anomic terror, a fear arising from the breakdown of meaning and structure.
His characters are adrift, alienated from themselves and the world around them, haunted by the feeling that something is deeply wrong, but unable to articulate what it is.
Right, and this is where Ligotti's use of the numinous becomes so fascinating. He draws on Rudolf Otto's idea of the numinous as this experience of awe and terror in the face of the holy other, but he kind of twists it and connects it to the Kantian noumenon, the thing in itself that's forever beyond our grasp.
So it creates this sense of numinous horror, a dread that arises not from something monstrous or grotesque, but from the sheer vastness and unknowability of existence.
Ligotti's work is deeply unsettling, precisely because it refuses to offer any easy answers or comforting resolutions. He forces us to confront the void, the meaninglessness, the utter indifference of the universe to our hopes and desires.
And it's this unflinching confrontation with the abyss that makes his work so compelling, so thought-provoking. It's a challenge to our comfortable assumptions about the world and our place in it.
Yeah, it's a call to awaken to the darkness, to the horror that lies at the heart of reality.
And it's a call that we're going to continue to explore as we delve into the work of Georges Bataille.
Indeed, Bataille takes us on a very different but equally unsettling journey into the depths of human experience.
And that's where we'll pick up in our next deep dive.
So we've talked about Ligotti and his exploration of the void through this lens of cosmic indifference and apophatic horror.
Right, this idea of the black universe, this realm of pure negativity.
Now let's shift our focus to Georges Bataille, who, like Ligotti, was drawn to negativity and exploring these limits of human experience, but he takes a slightly different approach.
Yeah, Bataille's relationship with mysticism is, it's interesting to say the least. I mean, he borrows heavily from mystical themes and ideas, but he's very much outside the structures of organized religion and conventional spirituality.
He even explicitly rejects the term mystical because of all the baggage it carries. He prefers inner experience to emphasize the deeply subjective individual nature of his own encounters with the unknown.
But even though he rejects the label, his work is still saturated with mystical ideas and imagery.
Absolutely. And his books like Inner Experience and Guilty really exemplify this weird mysticism that Baumgartner is talking about. They're fragmented, philosophical, deeply personal explorations of the limits of language and experience.
Bataille's writing is often described as transgressive, and this transgression is really central to his approach to mysticism.
Right. He writes about the shattering of individuality through things like torture, suggesting that accessing the beyond requires this violent opening of the self.
Yeah, this ties into his concept of the sacred, which for Bataille isn't about traditional notions of holiness or purity. It's about that which is set apart, that which disrupts our conventional categories of understanding, that which transgresses boundaries.
Exactly, the sacred for Bataille lies in those moments of intense experience, ecstasy, agony, even horror, where the self dissolves and we catch a glimpse of something beyond the limitations of our everyday perception.
And this is reflected in his writing style as well, wouldn't you say? His work is fragmented, deliberately anti-generic. It almost embodies the failure of language to capture this limitless nature of reality.
Absolutely. He's not trying to construct a coherent system or offer explanations for the unexplainable. He's trying to evoke the experience itself, the feeling of being overwhelmed, undone, shattered by this encounter with the sacred.
And this leads us to his fascination with terror and horror. He makes a clear distinction between the two, seeing terror as this expansive force that pushes us beyond the confines of the self, while horror is an inward collapse, a psychic implosion that annihilates the ego.
And then there's his perspective on God. He argues that the true terror of human experience isn't the fear of God's wrath, but the terror that arises from God's absence. The realization that there is no higher power, no ultimate meaning or purpose is the most terrifying truth we face.
And this brings us to his concept of the dark halo of sorrow, which he links to mystical individuation, this painful process of confronting our limitations and the essential solitude of the human condition.
And this sorrow isn't something to be avoided or overcome for Bataille. It's an intrinsic part of the mystical experience, this recognition of our finitude and the inevitability of death.
It's in embracing this sorrow, in confronting the void within and without, that we might find a deeper, more authentic way of being.
Bataille's weird mysticism is a difficult path, often disturbing, but it's one that ultimately leads to a radical confrontation with the self and the reality we inhabit.
Now let's move on to the final figure in our exploration of weird mysticism, E.M. Cioran, whose work embodies perhaps the most relentless pessimism of the three.
His focus is unwavering. Nothingness, despair, the inherent suffering of existence.
You could say his whole philosophy revolves around this idea of the horror of being oneself.
Yeah. He even rejects the notion of a unified self, claiming there is no E.M. Cioran in the sense of a stable, coherent identity. He sees himself as this liminal figure existing between categories, constantly shifting and dissolving.
And this is mirrored in his writing style as well. It's intensely fragmented, aphoristic, as if his thought process itself is disintegrating, reflecting this breakdown of meaning and selfhood that he's grappling with.
Yeah, he has this one line that really captures it. The horror of being no more than a soul in a gob of spirit. It perfectly encapsulates his view of human existence as this absurd, meaningless flicker of consciousness against the backdrop of this vast, indifferent universe.
He describes himself as a deject, someone existing in this third space, neither fully belonging to the world nor entirely rejecting it.
This position of profound alienation, marked by the constant awareness of the abyss that opens beneath our feet at every moment.
And for Cioran, death offers no escape. He views it as an indecent infinitude. Just another facet of this cosmic joke that is human existence.
There's no transcendence, no liberation, only the endless, meaningless cycle of being and non-being.
His concept of cosmic catachresis is really important here.
Right, catachresis is the misuse of language, and Cioran argues that all language is ultimately catachresis when applied to the universe.
So our words are inadequate, our concepts too small, our minds too limited to grasp the vastness and indifference of the cosmos.
It's like trying to contain the ocean in a teacup. The very act of trying to comprehend the universe to assign it meaning is a form of self-deception, a way to shield ourselves from the unbearable truth of our own insignificance.
And he takes this to its logical extreme, suggesting that true freedom lies in resisting the temptation to exist, in rejecting the very drive for meaning and purpose that defines human life.
It's a profoundly nihilistic perspective, but there's a strange kind of liberation in it as well.
And there are definite parallels between Cioran's work and cosmic horror, particularly this idea that human laws and emotions are utterly meaningless in the face of this vast cosmos.
He writes about thoughts being the fruit of sleeplessness, implying that true knowledge lies not in rational understanding, but in a state of unknowing, a kind of blissful ignorance.
He sees suffering as an inevitable aspect of existence, something to be endured rather than avoided.
He rejects all forms of liberation, all attempts to transcend the human condition.
For Cioran, there's no escape from the horror, only the possibility of confronting it with open eyes.
And this confrontation, this stark awareness of the void, can be a strangely liberating experience, even if it's also terrifying.
He encourages us to meditate on the self's non-existence, to realize that our identity is ultimately an illusion.
And this realization, while unsettling, can lead to a profound sense of freedom, a release from the anxieties and desires that bind us to this world of suffering.
Cioran's weird mysticism is a harsh, unforgiving philosophy, but it offers a unique perspective on the human condition, challenging us to confront the abyss without flinching.
So now that we've delved into the depths of Ligotti, Bataille, and Cioran, what are your thoughts? How do their ideas resonate with you?
Well, their shared emphasis on negativity and the limits of human understanding is definitely striking. Each, in their own way, forces us to confront the inadequacy of traditional philosophy and reason when grappling with the truly unsettling aspects of existence.
Yeah, it's like they're turning the tools of philosophy against itself, using logic and language to dismantle our comfortable assumptions about selfhood, meaning, and reality.
And while their conclusions are often bleak, there's a kind of brutal honesty to their approach. They refuse to sugarcoat the harsh realities of the human condition, choosing instead to stare into the abyss without flinching.
And it's this unflinching confrontation with the void, this willingness to embrace the darkness and horror that lurks at the edges of our awareness that makes their work so compelling.
They remind us that the universe isn't obligated to make sense, that our search for meaning may ultimately be futile.
But even in that futility, there's a certain beauty, a kind of terrible sublimity.
The beauty of confronting the void, of staring into the darkness and not looking away.
The realization that even in the absence of God, in the face of cosmic indifference, we are still here, still capable of experiencing the world, still able to ask these difficult questions.
And perhaps that is enough.
And it's a world that we can only glimpse through this lens of horror, through these kind of shattered fragments of language and thought.
But those fragments can illuminate a path forward, right?
Yeah, they can guide us towards a deeper, more authentic engagement with the mystery of existence.
So we have Ligotti with his black universe,
Right.
Bataille with his inner experience,
Yeah.
and Cioran with his radical acceptance of nothingness.
Three very distinct perspectives on navigating this very difficult terrain.
But all unified in this kind of unflinching honesty.
Right, they refuse to offer us any kind of false comfort or easy answers.
Yeah, they force us to grapple with those uncomfortable truths that we often try to avoid.
They raise these profound questions about the nature of selfhood, the limits of knowledge, and the very possibility of meaning in a universe that seems completely indifferent to our existence.
So in exploring weird mysticism, I think we've ventured pretty far beyond the realm of traditional philosophy and spirituality.
I think that's a good assessment.
I mean, we've encountered concepts that really challenge how we understand the world and our place in it.
And I think that's the point. It's not about finding answers or achieving enlightenment. It's about confronting the unknown, embracing the darkness, and recognizing the limitations of our human perspective.
It's about acknowledging the horror, the absurdity, and this kind of profound mystery of existence.
Exactly, even in the absence of any kind of grand cosmic purpose.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think we need to continue to explore these ideas, delve deeper into the works of Ligotti, Bataille, and Cioran, confront their unsettling visions, and allow ourselves to be challenged by their radical perspectives.
And in doing so, maybe we can discover a new way of seeing the world.
A way that embraces the darkness and the unknown.
A way that finds beauty in the face of the abyss.
Because ultimately, weird mysticism is a call to awaken to the strangeness and wonder of existence.
Even in its most terrifying aspects.